Warwick Castle is often remembered for its towering walls, its grand halls, and its place in the history of kings and nobles. But beneath all of that power and splendor was another world, a world that most people were never meant to see. If you walk down into the lower levels, into the earth beneath the stone, you come face to face with that world. It was the dungeon, and at its very heart, the torture chamber. Stepping into that chamber, even today, the first thing you feel is the cold. It isn't just a chill that fades once you stand still. It is the kind of cold that clings to you, that seeps into your bones. Just the sheer coldness was enough for anyone to suffer there. The walls drip with damp. The floor is uneven, slick in places where water still creeps through, and there is no sunlight, no natural warmth, only the heavy dark. The air itself told the story of what happened here. It was filled with the smell of human waste, decay, and mold. Imagine being dragged into that space, shackled in chains, and left in complete silence except for the sound of dripping water and the rattle of your own breath. For many, that alone was enough to begin breaking the spirit long before a hand was ever laid on them. The people who ended up in Warwick's dungeon were not all the same. Some were captured soldiers, men taken from the battlefields of the 100 Years' War with France. Others were men accused of treason during the bloody conflicts of the Wars of the Roses. And then there were townsfolk, ordinary people who had crossed the wrong lord or fallen victim to suspicion. Once the iron doors closed behind them, it did not matter what rank or title they held outside. In the dungeon, everyone was equal. Equal in fear, equal in suffering. Warwick Castle was more than just a fortress. In the 15th century, it became known as the seat of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man history remembers as the Kingmaker. He played a central role in deciding who sat on England's throne, and his power was not built only in the open field of battle or the royal court. It was also enforced here in these dark chambers. To be locked in Warwick's dungeon was not simply punishment, it was a message. It told others that the Earl's word was law and that his reach extended even into the cold, airless depths of the castle. For a prisoner descending those steps, each moment grew heavier. The sound of boots on stone, the echo of chains, the feeling of moving further from daylight, deeper into a place where cries could not escape. At the bottom, they entered the torture chamber, a room built with one purpose, to take away hope. The suffering here did not need to last long. For many, the fear of what could happen was almost worse than what did. At the center of the chamber stood the most feared device of them all, the rack. It looked simple, a heavy wooden frame fitted with rollers and ropes, but its design was enough to destroy the human body. Prisoners were tied by their wrists and ankles, stretched flat across the frame. Then the wheel was turned. Slowly, steadily, the ropes tightened. First came the dislocation of the shoulders and hips, then the tearing of muscles as they were forced beyond their natural limit. Bones cracked, tendons snapped, and joints were pulled apart. The pain was unbearable, and for those chained nearby, the sound was just as terrifying. The screams traveled through the stone corridors, reminding everyone else of what waited for them. The rack was not just about pain, it was about power. A man might stay silent for days in his cell, clinging to loyalty or defiance. But once his body was stretched past breaking, that silence rarely lasted. Confessions came quickly, some true, many false, all spoken in the desperate hope of ending the torment. The rack was less about finding justice and more about forcing submission, but the rack was only the beginning. Hanging from the ceiling were iron gauntlets, heavy cuffs fixed to thick chains. Prisoners were shackled by the wrists and left dangling, their feet barely brushing the ground. Their own body weight became the weapon. Hours of this dislocated shoulders cut off circulation and tore at the nerves. A man left too long might never move his arms again. It was a slow punishment, one that left the victim gasping and trembling long after he was lowered to the ground. Other methods seemed smaller, but they were no less cruel. Shackles fixed into the stone walls held prisoners in place, forcing them to stand or crouch for hours, sometimes days. Muscles cramped, sores formed, and exhaustion wore the body down. Stocks trapped the head and hands, leaving men defenseless against rats, insects, and even the guards themselves, who mocked and jeered at their misery. Then there was the gibbet, an iron cage built to hold the human body upright. Once inside, there was no sitting, no lying down, no rest. A prisoner stood until thirst and hunger consumed him. The gibbet was often placed in public view, sometimes even outside the castle walls, turning human suffering into a warning to everyone who saw it. Each device had its own purpose, its own way of wearing down flesh and spirit. None were used lightly. Records show torture at Warwick was not constant. It was used when answers were needed, when confessions had to be forced, or when an example had to be made. But this unpredictability made it worse. No one knew when it might be their turn. Days of waiting, weeks of fear, and then suddenly, without warning, the door would open and the guards would come. The chamber did not need to be filled with screams every day. The tools themselves, silent in the shadows, were enough to keep every prisoner in a state of terror. The people who ended up in Warwick's dungeon were not just thieves or murderers. Many were prisoners of war, men dragged from the battlefields of England and France. During the 100 Years' War, captured French soldiers were marched into the castle and locked in the cells. Some were high-born knights, others were common infantry. If their families had money, they might be ransomed and released. If not, they were left to rot in the dark. For those without wealth or influence, Warwick's dungeon was the end of the road. In the 15th century, Warwick Castle was ruled by Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, remembered by history as the Kingmaker. His name alone tells you what kind of power he held. He made and unmade kings during the Wars of the Roses, a period when loyalty could change in a single night and a wrong word could cost you everything. Political prisoners taken during these wars often found themselves chained in Warwick's lower chambers. They might have been men of high status, but down here their titles meant nothing. The dungeon leveled everyone, noble and commoner alike. Inside, the suffering was not just physical. The psychological weight of the dungeon broke many before torture even began. Imagine sitting in a pitch-black cell, chained to a wall, not knowing the day or the hour. You hear footsteps above, the rattle of keys in the distance, a torch flickers down the corridor, and you don't know if they're coming for you. Then, in the silence, you hear the screams. Someone else has been taken to the chamber, the sound of the rack turning, the cries echoing through the stone. That fear was constant. It poisoned the mind as surely as the damp air poisoned the body. A day in the life of a prisoner was a cycle of waiting. The cells were bare stone, with no bedding, no warmth, and no light. Food was little more than stale bread, thin gruel, or dirty water. Some days passed in complete silence. On others, guards came with chains to drag men into the chamber. For the ones left behind, the silence after the screaming was almost worse. They never knew if their time would come tomorrow, or in a week, or never at all. There are stories of prisoners carving marks into the walls to keep track of days, though in the darkness, time soon lost meaning. Some whispered prayers, others sang to themselves in broken voices. Many simply sat in silence, staring into the black. The dungeon stripped away more than the body. It stripped away the sense of being human. The dungeon gave Warwick Castle more than just a place to hold enemies. It gave the lords who ruled it a weapon of fear. Every prisoner locked here was a message to others: obey or end up in the dark. For the Earl of Warwick, who played kings like pieces on a board, that fear was just another tool of power. Life in Warwick's dungeon was already short, but disease made it even shorter. The cells were damp and airless. The stone dripped with moisture, and the floor was slick with waste. Wounds caused by shackles or whips quickly turned into open sores. Infection spreads fast. Without light, without clean water, even a small cut could be enough to kill. The prisoners lived side by side with rats and insects. Food scraps and human filth gave the vermin plenty to feed on. Rats crawled over sleeping bodies, chewing at sores and stealing crumbs of stale bread. Lice and fleas carried sickness from one prisoner to another. In an age where even the rich could die from infection, men in the dungeon had no chance. When plague came to Warwick, the dungeon became a trap. Prisoners who caught the sickness were often left where they lay. Guards sealed the cells, locking the sick inside with the healthy, hoping the disease would burn itself out. Some stories say entire groups of prisoners were bricked into rooms, their bodies left to rot together. The stench of death filled the lower halls. For those still alive, breathing that air was torture in itself. Even without plague, death was constant. Some starved after weeks of thin rations, others gave in to fever. Many never recovered from the rack or the gauntlets. Bones left broken, muscles torn, nerves destroyed. In that damp chamber, such wounds never healed. Prisoners died slowly, their bodies wasting away, their cries fading until silence was all that remained. The bodies had to go somewhere. Some were buried in shallow pits within the castle grounds, unmarked and forgotten. Others may have been dumped into plague pits outside the walls, mixed with townsfolk and soldiers alike. To the lords of Warwick, these prisoners were not people. They were problems to be dealt with, warnings to be remembered, and then, finally, bodies to be disposed of without ceremony. And then there were the guards. These were not men of kindness or mercy. Most were hardened by war. Many had seen violence long before they ever worked in a dungeon. Their job was to keep order, to make sure fear did its work. Some carried out their duties without thought, turning the wheels of the rack, tightening the chains, leaving men to hang in gauntlets as if it were routine. Others took pleasure in cruelty. There are accounts from other castles of guards mocking prisoners, feeding them scraps meant for animals, or striking them for sport. It is unlikely Warwick was any different. Yet even for the guards, the dungeon must have left its mark. Day after day they heard the cries, smelt the filth, and watched men waste away. To survive in such work, they had to shut off their own feelings, but the walls remembered, even if they tried to forget. The footsteps of the guards, the rattling of keys, the screams they unlocked, all of it became part of the chamber itself. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the use of torture in England began to decline. The law changed, and the methods of punishment shifted. Public hangings, executions, and prisons became the tools of authority, and chambers like the one at Warwick were used less and less. But the end of torture did not erase the memory of it. The walls of Warwick's dungeon held on to what had been done there. The stones still carried the weight of every scream, every body that broke within its grip. For centuries after, the dungeon was left as it was, cold, damp, and empty. The castle above continued to play its role in politics and society, but beneath the halls, the torture chamber remained as a reminder of a darker past. Local people told stories of the cries that once echoed through the ground. Some spoke of shadows moving in the chamber or of whispers in the silence. Even when no one was chained there, the space never felt empty. In more recent times, as Warwick Castle opened its doors to the public, the dungeon became a place of fascination. Visitors were drawn to the contrast between the grandeur of the halls above and the misery below. Guides described the rack, the gauntlets, the gibbet. They explained how prisoners were broken, how lives ended in darkness. For many who walked through, it was almost too much. Some visitors fainted in the chamber. Others rushed out, unable to stand the heavy air. Many spoke of the same feeling, that the silence was not natural, that the room itself was alive with what had happened there. Paranormal investigators have taken an interest in Warwick's dungeon. Some claim to have recorded voices or captured strange shapes on camera. Others describe sudden drops in temperature, cold touches on their skin, or the feeling of being watched. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it is difficult to deny the power of a place where so much human suffering took place. The history alone is enough to create that weight, that unease. But beyond stories of spirits and shadows, the torture chamber at Warwick remains important for another reason. It forces us to remember what power looked like in the past. Torture was not about justice, it was about control. It was a way for lords, kings, and jailers to hold power over bodies and minds, to make sure fear was stronger than rebellion. The dungeon tells us what happened when human life was seen as disposable, when pain was used as a tool of politics. Today, as thousands of people visit Warwick Castle each year, they see the grandeur of medieval power, the towers, the halls, the armor on display. But when they step into the dungeon, they see the other side. They see the cost of that power, and in the silence of the torture chamber, they are reminded that behind the splendor of castles and crowns, there was always suffering hidden in the dark.